They say money doesn't change people. That's a lie. Money doesn't change people, it reveals them. It strips away every mask, every performance, every carefully constructed version of who someone wants you to think they are. And in my family, the moment my parents' will was read aloud in a cold lawyer's office on a gray Tuesday morning, every mask came off at once. What I saw underneath nearly broke me. What I did about it. That's the story I'm here to tell you today. My name is Jordan. I'm 34 years old. I teach high school history in a small city in Ohio, and until 18 months ago, I genuinely believed I had a good family. Not a perfect one, nobody has one of those, but a real one. The kind where Sunday dinners run long, where your dad gives advice nobody asked for, where your mom keeps texting you recipes even though you never cook them. I had a sister named Claire, 3 years older, sharp as glass, beautiful in that way that always made rooms go quiet. We weren't best friends. There was always something a little guarded about her around me, something I could never quite name, but we were family. We showed up for each other. Or so I thought. My parents, Robert and Diane, were not wealthy people in the showy sense. They didn't drive luxury cars or take European vacations. My father ran a small plumbing supply business for 30 years, and my mother was a school administrator. But they were quiet wealthy, the kind of wealthy that only reveals itself when someone dies. They owned their home outright. They had investment accounts. They had a commercial property my father had purchased in 1998 that had quietly appreciated for decades. When everything was tallied, their estate came to just under $2.1 million. I did not know that number until the lawyer said it in that room. And then the lawyer kept talking, and the number became irrelevant to me, because what came next knocked the air clean out of my lungs. The estate, all of it, every dollar, every property, every account had been left entirely to Claire. I sat there in that chair and I waited for the lawyer to continue. Surely there was more. Surely there was an explanation embedded in legal language I hadn't parsed yet. But the lawyer set down the papers and looked at me over his glasses, and there was something in his expression that told me he had sat across from people in my exact position before, and he had never once found a version of it that wasn't devastating. Claire did not look at me. That was the thing I keep coming back to, even now. In the moment that my entire understanding of my family collapsed, my sister, who had apparently known what was in that will, because she showed no shock whatsoever, did not look at me. She looked at her hands. She looked at the window. She looked at the lawyer. She looked everywhere in the room except at the person sitting 4 feet away from her, who had just been erased. I drove home in silence. I didn't call anyone. I sat in my apartment and I stared at the wall and I tried to construct a version of my parents that could have made this decision, and I couldn't. These were the same 2 people who had told me my entire life that they loved both their children equally. My mother used to say it unprompted, "We don't have a favorite, you know that, right?" Why would she say that over and over if she didn't know that someday I might need to believe it? That question would turn out to be the thread. And when I finally pulled it, the whole thing came apart. The will included a letter. The lawyer handed it to me separately, sealed, with my name on the front in my father's handwriting. I didn't open it in the office. I opened it that night at my kitchen table with a glass of water I didn't drink. It was 4 paragraphs long. My father explained that the decision had not been made lightly, that they loved me, that this was not a punishment. And then, in the 3rd paragraph, he wrote the sentence that cracked my world in half. Claire told us what happened. We know about the money, Jordan. We know what you did. And we couldn't find a way past it. I read that sentence 11 times. I had absolutely no idea what he was talking about. There is a specific kind of panic that comes not from knowing something terrible, but from not knowing, from being accused of something, in the final words of people who are no longer alive to ask. I couldn't call my father and say, "What money? What are you talking about?" I couldn't sit across from my mother and watch her face while she answered. They were gone, and they had taken the original accusation with them, leaving me with nothing but my sister's version of a story I had never been told. I called Claire the next morning. She answered on the 4th ring, and her voice had a quality I hadn't heard before, not guilt exactly, but a kind of careful stillness, like someone who has rehearsed for a phone call and is now performing the rehearsal. I asked her directly. I said, "What did you tell them, Claire? What money?" She said she didn't know what I was talking about. I told her I had the letter. I read her the paragraph. The line went quiet for a long time. And then she said very calmly, that Dad must have been confused in his final months, that he'd been having memory issues, that the letter probably didn't mean what I thought it meant. My father had not had memory issues. He had been sharp until the week he died. I knew that, and Claire knew that I knew that, and yet she said it anyway, which told me everything I needed to know about how this conversation was going to go. I hung up. And then I did what I should have done before I ever made that call. I started digging. I want you to understand something about my sister that I hadn't fully understood before this. Claire is extraordinarily competent. She is organized, meticulous, and she thinks in long time horizons. Whatever she had told my parents, she hadn't told them impulsively. This had been a constructed narrative built carefully, and I was going to need to dismantle it the same way piece by piece with evidence. The first thing I did was contact my parents' accountant, a man named Gerald who had handled their finances for nearly 20 years. I told him I was trying to understand the estate and asked if we could meet. He agreed, and 2 weeks later I sat in his office and told him about the letter. Gerald was quiet for a moment. Then he pulled up his files. What he showed me was this. In 2019, 4 years before my parents died, there had been a transfer from my parents' joint account. $43,000, moved in 2 transactions to an external account. Gerald had flagged it at the time and asked my father about it. My father had told him it was a personal matter, and that it had been resolved. Gerald had noted it and moved on. The external account, Gerald confirmed after I pressed him, had been traced at the time to my name. My name. An account I had never opened connected to a transfer I had never received using my identity. I left Gerald's office and I sat in my car for a long time. $43,000 had been stolen from my parents and deposited into an account in my name. My parents had found out, presumably because Claire had told them, and they had believed that I had done it. They had spent the last 4 years of their lives thinking their son had stolen from them. They had not confronted me. They had not asked for an explanation. They had simply, quietly rewritten their will, and said nothing, and carried that wound until they died. I think about that silence often. I think about what it cost them to believe something like that about their own child and choose not to say a word. And I think the reason they didn't say anything is because saying it would have required them to live inside the answer, to look at me over Sunday dinners knowing what they believed I had done. And they couldn't do it. So they said nothing. They loved me from a distance they had constructed to protect themselves, and I never even noticed the gap because I didn't know there was supposed to be something there. Claire had taken $43,000 from our parents. She had opened an account in my name, deposited the money there, moved it elsewhere, and then, and this is the part that still takes my breath away when I think about it, she had gone to our parents and told on me. She had manufactured the crime and then reported the criminal. And they had believed her because why would your daughter lie about something like that? What kind of person does something like that? I was going to find out exactly what kind of person. The paper trail that existed was thin but real. Gerald's record showed the flagged transfer. I hired a forensic accountant. A decision that cost me $3,800 I didn't really have. And within 6 weeks she had found the ghost account, traced the IP address used to open it, and identified the device. It was Claire's laptop. I want to tell you that when I had the evidence in my hands I felt powerful, that I felt the ground shift back underneath my feet and the scales tip in my direction. But the truth is that sitting at my kitchen table staring at a forensic accountant's report with Claire's laptop ID on the last page, what I felt was grief, a specific, suffocating grief that had nothing to do with the money and everything to do with the realization that my sister, the person I had grown up with, the person who had driven me to my first day of college and cried in the parking lot when she dropped me off, had looked my parents in the eye and told them their son was a thief, and had then come to every Christmas and every Thanksgiving and every birthday dinner for 4 years and sat across from me and passed the salt and asked about my job and hugged me goodbye at the door, and none of it had been real, none of it, and I had not seen a single sign because I had not been looking for one because you do not look for knives in the hands of people you trust completely. I called my forensic accountant, a woman named Sandra who had the calm, unhurried energy of someone who had seen every variation of human dishonesty, and was no longer surprised by any of it, and I asked her what she thought I should do next, and she told me clearly and without drama that what I had was enough to take to a lawyer and potentially enough to take to law enforcement, and that the decision about which door to walk through first was mine and mine alone. I chose the lawyer. I found a civil attorney named Patrick who specialized in estate disputes and financial fraud, And I sat in his office for 2 hours and laid out everything: the will, the letter, the flag transfer, Sandra's report, the laptop ID. And when I was done, he leaned back in his chair and said that in 20 years of practice he had seen siblings do extraordinary things to each other over inheritance, but that the degree of premeditation involved in what Claire had done placed this in a category he didn't encounter often. He said we had a viable case for fraud, for defamation, and potentially for a full challenge of the will on the grounds that it had been procured through deliberate misrepresentation. Then he told me what all of that would cost, and I nearly laughed because the number was significant and I was a high school history teacher who had just been disinherited, but I had a small amount in savings and I had a case, and sometimes that is enough to start. I did not tell Claire I was coming. I drove to her house on a Saturday morning in October, the kind of cold, clear morning where the sky is so blue it almost looks artificial, and I knocked on her door, and when she opened it and saw my face she knew immediately that something had changed. I could see it in the way her expression reorganized itself in the half-second before she composed it into something neutral, and I told her I needed to come inside, and she stepped back and let me in because she didn't have a choice. That didn't look worse than the alternative. I sat down at her kitchen table and I put Sandra's report in front of her and I watched her read it, and I want to tell you she broke, that she crumbled and confessed, and the whole thing resolved itself in that kitchen on that October morning. But that is not what happened, because Claire is not someone who breaks easily, she is someone who pivots, and what she did when she finished reading was look up at me with an expression I can only describe as almost impressed and tell me that the report was circumstantial, that IP addresses could be spoofed, that she had no idea how her laptop information had ended up connected to that account, and that if I was planning to drag this into a courtroom I needed to think very carefully about what that was going to do to what remained of our family. And I looked at her across that table and I thought about my father writing that letter. I thought about my mother saying unprompted over and over that she didn't have a favorite. I thought about 4 years of Sunday dinners where my parents had looked at me and seen a thief, and I told Claire very quietly that there was nothing left of our family to protect, and that I would see her in court. Okay, I have to stop here for a second because I have been sitting with this story for a while now and I need to tell you what I actually think about it, because if I just kept narrating without saying something I would be doing you a disservice. And the thing I keep coming back to, the thing that genuinely disturbs me more than the money or the fraud or even the will, is the silence, the 4 years of silence from Jordan's parents, the decision Robert and Diane made to believe what Claire told them and then simply never speak of it again, never confront Jordan, never give him the chance to defend himself. And I understand grief and I understand the desire to avoid conflict, but these were his parents, these were the two people in the world most obligated to say, is this true? And they didn't. They just quietly rewrote him out of their lives and out of their estate and kept showing up to dinners and kept saying I love you and kept letting him believe everything was fine. And I think that is the most painful part of this entire story, because the fraud was Claire's crime but the silence was a choice his parents made every single day for 4 years, and Jordan has to carry that too. He has to carry being betrayed not just by his sister but by the people who were supposed to know him well enough to doubt the accusation in the first place. So I want to ask you, drop it in the comments right now. Do you think Jordan's parents were cowards for staying silent, or do you think they were trying to protect themselves the only way they knew how? Because I genuinely cannot make up my mind about that, and I think your answers are going to be fascinating. Now back to Jordan. The legal process was not fast and it was not clean and it was not the satisfying cinematic confrontation that part of Jordan had hoped for when he walked into Patrick's office. What it was long, grinding, exhausting work that consumed 14 months of his life and cost him more money than he had originally budgeted and tested his resolve in ways he had not anticipated. Because Claire did not fold, she hired her own attorney, a sharp woman who filed countermotions and challenged the admissibility of Sandra's report, and argued that the laptop identification was insufficient without corroborating evidence linking Claire directly to the fraudulent transactions. And for a period of about 4 months in the middle of the case, Jordan genuinely did not know which way it was going to go. He was sleeping badly, he was distracted at work, 2 of his colleagues noticed and asked if he was okay, and he told them he was dealing with a family matter, which is the most insufficient sentence in the English language for what he was actually living through. The turning point came not from Sandra's report and not from Patrick's arguments but from a source Jordan had not anticipated: his parents' neighbor, a retired woman named Evelyn who had been close to his mother for 30 years. And who reached out to Patrick's office after she heard through mutual acquaintances that a legal dispute was underway. Evelyn had something Patrick had not known to look for. In the months before his parents died, his mother Diane had confided in Evelyn, not about the full story, not about the money or the accusation, but about a specific painful feeling she couldn't shake, that she had done something she couldn't undo and that she wasn't sure she had been right, that she had trusted someone she loved and she was starting to wonder if that trust had been misplaced. She had not named Claire. She had not named Jordan. But Evelyn had remembered the conversations and had kept a journal for decades and had written some of it down, and when she handed those journal pages to Patrick in his office, he called Jordan immediately and told him that the emotional and circumstantial picture of the case had just shifted meaningfully in their direction. Claire's attorney requested a settlement meeting 3 weeks after Evelyn's journal pages were submitted into evidence. Jordan sat across a conference table from his sister for the second time, and this time Claire did not look anywhere except straight ahead. And this time her expression was not composed, it was tired, and Jordan thought she looked older than he had ever seen her look, and he felt something he had not expected to feel, which was not satisfaction but a dull, hollow sadness, because winning was not going to give him back 4 years, it was not going to give him back his parents, it was not going to give him back the version of his sister he had believed in before that Tuesday morning in the lawyer's office. And he sat there knowing he was going to win and feeling none of the things he had promised himself he would feel when this moment arrived. The settlement took 3 days to negotiate, and when it was done, Jordan walked out of Patrick's office into the gray November air and stood on the pavement for a long time doing nothing, just breathing, just existing in the strange quiet that follows the end of something that has consumed you so completely that you have forgotten what it felt like to have a mind that wasn't occupied by it every waking hour. And the terms were significant. Claire agreed to return the full value of the fraudulent transfer with interest. She agreed to a formal acknowledgement of misrepresentation that Patrick had fought hard to include because Jordan had been clear that the money was secondary to the record. He wanted something in writing that said what she had done and why it had mattered, and the estate was restructured through the court's intervention so that Jordan received an equitable share of what his parents had built over 30 years. Not everything, not a vindication that erased the original wound, but a fair portion of a life his parents had worked for and that he had been entitled to before his sister had decided otherwise. And he took all of that and he felt almost nothing, which confused him at first and then stopped confusing him when he talked about it with his therapist, a quiet man named Dr. Osei, who had been helping Jordan navigate the psychological wreckage of the past 14 months, and who told him that the absence of euphoria after a legal victory in a case rooted in grief was not a malfunction. It was a recognition that the court had given him money and a document, and it could not give him the thing he had actually lost, which was the story he had told himself about his family for 34 years, the narrative of Sunday dinners and past salt and parking lot tears and a mother who said unprompted that she didn't have a favorite. All of that had been revealed as something more complicated and more fragile than he had known, and no settlement agreement had the power to restore it, and so Jordan took what he had won and he sat with the grief of what he hadn't, and slowly, in the way that healing works, which is not linear and not dramatic but incremental and quiet and largely invisible from the outside, he began to rebuild. He sold the apartment he had been living in when all of this started because he found he couldn't be in it without associating every corner of it with the worst 14 months of his life, and he moved to a smaller place across the city with large windows and a view of a park, and he kept teaching, kept standing in front of teenagers every morning explaining history and cause and effect and the long consequences of short decisions. And he told me that there was something almost unbearably ironic about teaching historical betrayals to 16-year-olds while living through one of his own, but that the irony eventually softened into something more useful, a kind of perspective, because history is in many ways just the study of what people do to each other when power and money and fear are involved. And Jordan had a front row seat to his own case study, and he came out the other side with a clarity about human nature that he said he would not trade even though the tuition had been brutal. As for Claire, and I know you want to know about Claire, she did not disappear, which might have been easier in some ways. She remained a presence at the edges of Jordan's life in the way that family does even after catastrophic rupture. There were mutual relatives who asked careful questions at careful times. There were holidays where her name came up and Jordan had to decide in real time how much of himself to spend on the answer, and he told me that he had arrived at a position that was not forgiveness in the soft cinematic sense of that word but something more like comprehension. He had thought a great deal about who Claire was and what she must have believed she was doing, and he had concluded that she was someone who had spent her entire life feeling like she was owed something that was being withheld from her, and that the particular tragedy of people like that is that no amount of money actually fills the thing they're trying to fill, And so Claire had taken $43,000 and a $2.1 million estate, and she had bought herself a legal battle and a court document that described her fraud in formal language and a brother who looked at her now with something colder than anger. And whether she understood what she had actually lost in that transaction, Jordan genuinely didn't know. And he told me he had stopped spending energy trying to figure it out because the answer was hers to arrive at, not his to excavate. And that is where Jordan's story ends, or at least where this chapter of it ends, because stories like this don't really end, they just change shape, they become part of the architecture of a person, they inform how someone moves through the world and what they notice and what they no longer take for granted. And I have been sitting with Jordan's story for long enough now that I have developed some very specific thoughts about it that I need to share with you before we close out today, because that is what I do. I cannot simply narrate and walk away. This story has been living in my chest since I first heard it, and I owe you my honest reaction, and here it is. The thing that I cannot stop thinking about, the image that keeps returning to me, is Claire at that kitchen table in October reading Sandra's report, and the half second before she composed her expression, that tiny unguarded flicker, because in that half second I think you could see everything. I think you could see that she knew exactly what the document meant and exactly what she had done and exactly how long she had been doing it. And she looked at her brother across the table and she made the decision in real time to keep going, to pivot, to fight, to look him in the eye and say it was circumstantial. And I think about what it takes to be that person. I think about what has to be true about your inner life to look at someone who loves you and has been wronged by you and choose, in that specific moment, to cause more harm rather than less, and my honest conclusion is that Claire was not acting out of pure greed. I think greed was the mechanism, but the engine was something older and deeper. I think she had spent decades feeling like Jordan was the favorite in some way she couldn't articulate and couldn't prove but couldn't stop believing. And I think the $43,000 started as something she told herself she deserved, and the lie to their parents started as something she told herself was just leveling the score. And by the time she was sitting across from Jordan in that October kitchen, the original justification had been buried so deep under subsequent decisions that she may not have been able to find it anymore even if she'd wanted to. And that is not an excuse. I want to be very clear that none of that is an excuse, but I think it is an explanation, and I think explanations matter because if we don't try to understand how people become capable of this kind of sustained, calculated harm, we are going to keep being blindsided by it. And the world will keep producing Claires because nobody stopped to ask what made her. Now here is the question I have been turning over, and I genuinely want your answer in the comments. Do you think Jordan made the right call by settling, or should he have pushed all the way through to a full trial and a public record? Because Patrick told him a trial was winnable, he made that choice himself to settle. And I understand why. I understand the exhaustion and the cost and the desire to be done, but there is a part of me that wonders whether a full public verdict would have served not just Jordan but anyone else in Claire's life who deserved to know what she was capable of. And I don't know the right answer, I really don't, and I think your instincts on that are going to be sharper than mine because you've been listening to this story the whole way through and you know these people now almost as well as I do, so drop it in the comments. Tell me what you would have done in Jordan's position. Tell me if you have a Claire in your family, because based on the messages I get every single week, I know that a significant number of you do. And this community we have built here is one of the only places where people feel safe enough to say that out loud, and I don't take that lightly. And now, what do I think would have happened if things had gone differently, if Jordan had never opened that letter, or if he had opened it and decided it wasn't worth the fight? I think he would have spent the rest of his life with a version of his family that was a lie. I think he would have noticed the distance in his parents without ever understanding it and attributed it to age or illness or the natural drift that happens between adults. I think he would have stood at their graves with complicated feelings he couldn't name and carried a low-grade grief that had no proper object, and I think Claire would have kept the money and kept the estate and kept the story she'd told, and maybe she would have felt satisfied, and maybe, in the quiet moments, she would have felt the specific hollowness of a person who has won something that cost them their own integrity, because that is what I believe about ill-gotten things. I believe they sit differently in your hands than earned things do. I believe you feel the difference even when you refuse to acknowledge it. But Jordan opened the letter. And Jordan pulled the thread. And Jordan showed up at that kitchen table and put the report down and said, "I know what you did." And because he did that, he got to stand in a courtroom, metaphorically speaking, and have the truth told on his behalf, and he got to rebuild, and he is rebuilding, and that matters more than any dollar figure in that settlement agreement. If this story hit you the way it hit me, I need you to do 3 things right now. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, because we do this every single week. We sit with real human stories and we refuse to look away from the complicated parts. Hit the like button because it genuinely helps more people find these stories who need to hear them. And leave me a comment telling me your reaction. Tell me which moment in Jordan's story stopped you cold. Tell me if you saw Claire coming or if it blindsided you the way it blindsided Jordan, because every comment you leave is proof that stories like this deserve to be told, and that this community is worth showing up for every single week. And I will see you in the next one.